David Rutherfod is the Chief Commissioner for the Human Rights Commission, and he is a particularly significant appointment because of his background. Now, what we are doing now is talking about the complaints bodies, and David, of course, prior to his appointment as Chief Commissioner, was the Managing Director of Special Olympics Asia Pacific, based in Singapore, and of course we know him because he was Chief Executive of the New Zealand Rugby Union. He's worked as a sport and commercial lawyer at Balgully, Gibson Sheet and Goodmans, and he has been chairman of the Special Olympics in New Zealand. But I found a particular bond with David because he also is committed to ensuring that human rights is relevant to business. And generally when you start talking about human rights, business tunes out because they don't think it's relevant to them. But increasingly, of course, human rights is incredibly important to business. It fills out the concept of corporate social responsibility, and internationally now there are norms developing with respect to how business should be dealing with human rights in the workplace. David, come and talk to us about your role and your experiences.
Well, firstly, I'm not going to tell you a lot about human rights in business today, but just let me say that, sort of picking up on one of the earlier speakers, that living in Singapore, you see the reality that NGOs, businesses and governments are all viewed with equal suspicion, and that also I think in Asia in particular, businesses are at the forefront of the improvement of human rights outcomes and at the forefront of the abuse of human rights on both sides. But May asked me to talk to you about how can citizens make better use of the Human Rights Commission. I'm not sure if David McGee's here, but I need to tell you that if I wasn't the Human Rights Commissioner telling this story, he would be part of the story too, and the Ombudsman played an important part in the story that I'm going to tell you. So I'm going to talk to you about, not from my current role, but the experience that I had as a citizen a few years ago with the Human Rights Commission and how it helped me and some other citizens deal with the problem we had. And any citizen that has tried to do it knows that there's no equality of arms when you challenge power. It's an exhausting and relentless effort. And Gandhi got it right when he said about change. He said, first they will ignore you, then they will laugh at you, then they will fight you, and then you will win. And the Commission can be your ally in that process. And in some cases, like parents as caregivers, the Office of Human Rights Proceedings will fight in the courts for citizens' rights, but it's actually rare for the office to do so. Most of the requests to the office for help are actually turned down because the director needs to steward his relatively meagre resources, and also the grounds are limited, and as the learned judge has just told you, the remedies actually aren't always the best anyway. So even when he takes on a case though, he has limited resources and he fights a largely well-resourced state legal team. And in Parents and Caregivers as an example, we know that the Crown has spent $1.2 million on that case to date, and that the Commission and the Office and the Commission in its role as intervener have spent about $400,000. Now that's well beyond all but the richest of citizens of New Zealand. So most often the fight will not be taken in the courts. The fight will be taken in the way that Mai Chen's book so wonderfully points out and is so useful for, and we didn't have it when we had our issue. And what happened in the situation I was in was that I was reading the paper one January in 2008, and the Dominion Post reported that 9 students had been seriously assaulted by 6 students in the school that my child went to. I called the police that day to say that we would support those parents and those children as parents, and that began a 3-year effort by a group of citizens in which we received great support from the Human Rights Commission. What struck Gretchen and I when we read the news was not that was basically that we had not been told the full situation when we went to see the same school's leadership the previous December, in the same week that these assaults had occurred, about a serious assault that had occurred to one of our children in the school. We were left with the impression that that was an isolated incident. We didn't believe it was, but that's the impression we were left with. But like lots of people, we just got on with things. We didn't report it to the police, but the report in the paper a month or so later changed that. And last week we remembered Anzac Day, the day we remember the sacrifice of those from New Zealand and Australia who served in the armed forces. Over 70 years ago, almost to the day, there were about 160,000 New Zealanders serving in Africa and Europe, and they were told by their government that they were fighting for freedom. Quite specifically, freedom from fear and freedom from want. Two things that we still need to fight for in our country today. But while the armed forces fought in Europe for freedom, our politicians and our public servants and our academics and historians and lawyers in particular from Victoria University worked in Wellington and Canberra to make sure the sacrifice was not in vain. Together, these New Zealanders and Australians are in no small way responsible for the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all that followed. New Zealand wanted binding conventions and no veto for the superpowers, and it took decades to get the conventions New Zealand wanted. The agreement by New Zealand to be bound by the conventions, the passing of the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act and the Human Rights Act are a domestic manifestation of the lessons learned in World War II. Upholding them is not just a legal tick-box compliance exercise. Upholding them is one of the most powerful acts of remembrance that you can make as a New Zealander. In 2008, a dozen parents faced sons fearful of returning to school because the offenders were back in the classroom. This was the complete opposite of freedom from fear. The parents also knew that many students across New Zealand feared going to school. And the state that the citizen faced was two-faced. On the one hand, a police force that stood strongly for the dignity and rights of all the students affected, both the bully and the victim. And on the other hand, an education system from school to ministry and ERO that didn't seem to want to protect the freedoms and dignity of the victims and wanted to ignore or even deny the truth of what happened. The parents had no confidence that the education system was doing its utmost to ensure schools were safe. They were determined to do everything they could to make sure it never happened to their children again and it never happened to anyone else's children. They did not want to sue the school. We didn't have the advice of Justice Blanchard, but it seemed futile. And we also recognised that the Board of Trustees was another group of volunteer citizens just doing their best, and that the teachers were trying to do their best. And we also realised that those people didn't have the guidance they needed from the ministry, or in our opinion they didn't. So we called the Human Rights Commission and asked, isn't this a human rights issue? And we talked about the right to life, the right to personal security, and the right to education. And the Commission said yes, and said they'd publish a report explaining why, and they did that. My predecessor, Rosalind Lennon, took a personal interest and provided personal support to us. And something I've done already since, and I'll do again, as the occasion arises. And so do my fellow commissioners. The staff were incredibly patient, helpful and encouraging, but they did not do our job for us. Citizens who take on power will always bear most of the workload, but the Commission can lessen it. The Commission's interest, and also the Ombudsman's, encouraged our small group to keep going. I'll never forget in my new role how important this was for the affected parents. They wanted their boys to know that they would see the truth told and that the state would protect their freedom, their dignity and their rights. They did eventually see that, but it was a sad victory because the personal damage was done. The issues with the offenders were sorted out relatively quickly by the police justice restorative justice processes, but the education system largely remained in denial for nearly 3 years that it took the Ombudsman to get the truth out in the open. So over 70 years ago, thousands died to achieve freedom from fear. Yet today, children all over New Zealand wake up fearful of going to school. How many we don't know, and that's part of the problem. We do know it's a lot, maybe as high as 30% in some year groups. And the Commission is going to make sure that we can effectively monitor the rates of violence in schools. We will make sure students and parents know what to do if something goes seriously wrong, and that is ring the police. And we will work with those who are working hard to prevent violence and bullying in schools, and there is a lot of good work going on. But in particular, we will work with the young New Zealanders who have the power to be the change in their schools in the same way that young New Zealanders were part of the change in the world 70 years ago. Thank you.